our very own fellow Miklos Zala. So one thing I should also add is that we will be recording today's sessions, and this recording after a couple of weeks or so will end up on our YouTube channel for the Center of Advanced Studies, so that we have a living archive of these sessions. If anybody would not be comfortable in appearing, you're very welcome to keep the cameras off, and also maybe still contribute by posting eventually any question you might have in the chat. So we're also happy to be intermediaries if you prefer not to appear on video and still would like to input. Without further ado, then, sorry, the last small house recommendation would be to keep everyone's microphones on mute until Professor Baccarini will be speaking, and then we can then activate the microphones as we start the chat at the end. So Miklos, if you're online, I shall introduce you quickly, and then you can do the honors after that. So Miklos Zala received his PhD in political theory from Central European University, and his research focuses on political philosophy and applied ethics. During his doctoral studies, he was a visiting researcher at Aarhus University, Rothschild Universities, and the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Before joining us at Szasz, he was affiliated with the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics in Tel Aviv, where his work was focused on the question of what makes gentrification unjust. Before being a Safra Fellow, he was also a member of the Center for European Union Research, CEUR, at the Central European University, where he had been working on the European Commission Horizon 2020 project, Ethos, a theory of European justice, and at the Center for Social Sciences, Institution for Political Sciences, Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Center of Excellence. Very long title there, but here we are. So very many great topics, and Miklos, welcome, and I leave to you to introduce properly Professor Baccarini. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Valeria, for the introduction. Yeah, maybe I should keep that title shorter. We will see. I'm Miklos Zala, and I will lead this session today. And it is my pleasure to introduce you Professor Elvio Baccarini, who is the Professor of Ethics and Political Philosophy at the University of Rijeka.
I think we lost me.
Yes, I was going to interject. Let's see. It happened before, and that was solved eventually. So maybe we can leave it a few seconds. Otherwise, we might try something different.
Sorry, I guess you lost me. Well, should I start it over again? Okay, I apologize. Yeah. So it is my pleasure to introduce you today, Professor Elvio Baccarini from the University of Rijeka, who is a professor of ethics and political philosophy at the university. Professor Baccarini has published several books, including public reason and biotechnologies, the political philosophy of John Stuart Mill, moral epistemology, and practical ethics.
This is one of those days, it froze again. Perhaps I will ask Miklos to maybe just leave the floor for Elvio, and then we get to the meat of the matter quickly.
Sorry, I was cut again.
Yes, Miklos, I think we'll leave the floor to Elvio now, if you don't mind. And
okay, I really apologize for this bad connection. I have it right now.
Not your fault. It's as we say, it's life in the post-digital age. So we'll make sure we'll make up for this to Elvio at the first opportunity. A rocky start, but yes, let's welcome you, and yes, I look forward to hearing more and to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I hope there will not be any more unexpected and unwelcome troubles, at least until I end. So the day started on the road for me today, and right from the beginning, I thought it's going to be one of these days when that one expects to arrive that evening and that the day ends. But now I enjoy very much the pleasure to be with you, and I thank you very much for the invitation, and hope that the topic that I offer to you will be interesting to you, and also the way how I will realize it. So first, maybe do you want me to share the PowerPoint presentation, or if you don't need it, however you want? Okay, so you see the PowerPoint presentation. Can I go on? I don't hear objections, so I suppose that everything's going well. So this talk is part of a research project. There are several of us, but the nucleus working on these questions is the members of this nucleus are Tina Baručić, postdoc, and Ivan Martinic, who is a PhD student in our department. And the research project is public justification and the pluralism of capabilities, and the questions that we mainly discuss are questions of philosophy of psychiatry, of mental health, of mental well-being, mental disabilities in relation to the values that we employ in these fields, and thus in intersection with political philosophy. And I am a political philosopher, so this is primarily my contribution. So, which is the problem of this talk, but in general, the problem that that we analyze and discuss in our group. So is the problem to how to properly define some conditions as disabilities and some persons as disabled from the medical point of view. And right from the beginning, we have a terminological question represented by the use of the proper expression disabilities, or one could say, why not disorders, why not illness, and why not disease? So in fact, the terminological dispute is a mess, and there are some attempts to introduce some order. For example, Elisabetta La Lumera from Bologna is doing quite a good job, but people are still using different expressions in these discussions, which is not completely arbitrarily, because it depends also from the point of view. Because we discuss the question from the standpoint of the capability approach, we use the expression disabilities, mental disabilities. However, this needs to be qualified, as I will do soon. But perhaps maybe not all of you are familiar with the expression capability approach. So the capability approach is represented, as the word says, by an approach that includes several theories, where the central concept is that of capability. So what is capability? Capability is the effective capacity of being or doing something. So let's imagine that we have all political rights, but let's imagine that some of us are discriminated, have no available education or no available access to the media. Then we would say that although formally our political rights are recognized, we don't have the capability to realize the political rights. So we don't have the effective capacity of exercising political rights. So here we immediately arrive to one important distinction, and it is the distinction between disabilities from the medical point of view and disabilities from the social or political point of view. So the latter are disabilities present because of discrimination, stigmatization, and favorable environmental conditions, and so on. Such are, for example, disabilities suffered by discriminated groups like women in some parts of the world now, or like women in huge parts of history, that even when formally recognized, for example, of some rights, or formally declared as equals, do not have the effective capacities to exercise their virtues because of stigmatization, because of unfavorable environment conditions, and so on. In this case, the disability is present independently of the real merits, of the real capacities, of the real talents, of the real dispositions of the person. Simply, there are disabilities because of unfavorable external conditions. On the other hand, the disabilities in the medical sense are due, at least partly, or an important part, because of impairments, which is the absence of internal capabilities. So deafness is an impairment. The capacity of social communication, I mean, the absence of the capacity for social communication due to some mental problem, for example, of physiological nature, are impairments. So medical disabilities are disabilities that include impairments. There are some cases clear and difficult to distinguish. So, for example, in some cases, we have impairments that would not be the cause of disabilities in more favorable conditions. So it's not automatic, it's not mechanical that impairments are transformed into disabilities. So, for example, one disputed case is the case of deafness, where people say, some activists, not all deaf people, some of them, some activists say, yeah, we are impaired. Obviously, we are impaired because we don't have the capacity to hear. But this is not a disability if we look to a wider disability, the disability to communicate in favorable conditions. So in conditions where we are allowed and supported in our way of communication, then deafness would not be a disability from the standpoint of the capability of communication. I think, by thinking about mental impairments, autistic conditions. So, speaking about autistic conditions, we must be very careful because autism is a very wide concept. It's a spectrum that includes several very different conditions. But think about some highly functioning autistic persons. This is the official definition, highly functioning autistic persons. that have nonetheless difficulties to work in noisy environments. Some noises or colors or lights can be very much disturbing to these people. This would be a disability when there is the presence of this noise or these lights or these colors, but would not be in favorable conditions. So as we see, it's difficult to establish in some cases when we have a disability caused because of the impairment or a disability caused because of unfavorable external conditions. So because of this difficulty, there is the further problem of establishing how and when can we define a condition as a disability and a person as disabled, instead of defining, for example, an environment as not functional or as discriminatory. And the questions are obviously related to human rights, shown also by the intense activities of some activist movements for the recognition of their conditions as not as condition of disability, but merely a condition of diversity. So speaking outside the field of mental disabilities, some deaf people, some activists in deaf people movements say that they are not disabled, they are simply a linguistic minority. Or there are some autistic persons who are activists in the movement of neurodiversity, and they say we are not disabled, we are only neurologically diverse. And here we have activists, but have also important theoreticians like Shane Dlakin that we will discuss, or Jessica Began that has recently published some articles against the automatic translation of impairments in disabilities, and insisting for giving the voice on people involved themselves. However, other people struggle for the recognition of their status as a status of disability, because they think there's no point in denying that we are disabled, and it's even harmful. So they say, yeah, we are disabled, we want to be recognized as disabled, and this is why we require social and medical support. So the question is how to resolve these disputes. And some people say that they are not resolvable. So even in the 60s, I think there are the roots of the present debates and disputes and public struggles, and from a general skepticism applied on psychiatry, and with expressions like the myth of mental illness. So there are authors like Thomas Szasz who say there's no mental illness. Mental illness is an invention, is a myth. And why? Because serious, real, the only medicine is a kind of natural science. So it's a discipline that can identify illness and disease and disability through the methods of natural sciences. So it's based on objective facts, while psychiatry is based on values. And because of this, it leaves the space for manipulations, and psychiatry in general has affirmed itself as a repressive system that institutionalizes the imposition of sectarian evaluative standards. That is, evaluative standards embraced by only some, but not by all people. So think, for example, about homosexuality as a case that speaks very much in support of Thomas Szasz. But there are other authors who react, and who defend psychiatry. And some of them want to naturalize psychiatry, and today's discussion does not consider this position. It's totally uninteresting for them. But I will refer to authors who accept the idea that psychiatry is based on evaluative standards, but are engaged in showing that this does not necessarily lead to a loss of objectivity and does not necessarily lead to repression or oppression. The first set of answers, maybe the most natural, is represented by Aristotelian proposals. Such are proposals that assume a standard evaluation of human nature and define deviations from such descriptions as disabilities. However, other authors reject even these Aristotelian proposals and look for the objectivity of psychiatric distinctions in a different way. And the reason is that such authors deny the possibility of affirming a standardized view of human nature with normative strength. And among some authors, there are those that I mentioned, Shane Gleckin, which wrote a very important paper in 2016, and Jessica Bagon, who wrote several important papers in the 2020, 2021, and 2022. So they say we must not rely on standardized views of human nature. Instead, we must be open to pluralism. And we must not rely on an autonomous theoretical work done by a theoretician. Instead, we must listen to the various first-person evaluations of human conditions. And we obtain this through attributing a prominent role to personal perspectives. So we must care about people in some conditions themselves think about their conditions. And I think that this recommendation indicates the right path. However, I think that views must also be entered through a proper epistemology and a model of public justification in order to avoid that evaluative standards are hostages of various kinds of flaws. And this is the attempt of the present paper that proceeds like this. So first I present Gleckin's and Bagon's criticisms of the Aristotelian or of Aristotelian-like theories, and I show Gleckin's and Bagon's proposals. Second, I indicate some weaknesses of Gleckin's and Bagon's proposals. And third, I sketch the model of public justification that represents the best resource for the public justification of evaluative standards employed in psychiatry. So, in opposition to the Aristotelian views, Gleckin says that whether facts are bad or not does not depend on a standardized normative view of human nature, but on personal and environmental contextual evaluations. So, for example, a form of immobility is bad only if a specific kind of mobility is required by our environment. But mobility through a wheelchair can be described as a possible advantage in some circumstances. To this example put forward by Shane Gleck, we can add the example of autistic persons. So some of their characteristics are impairments from some points of view, but advantages from other. Again, please always have in mind that autism is a very various spectrum. And when speaking about autistic conditions, we speak about very specific cases today. So we see how some impairments can be seen also some advantages. When we start by considering the central coherence that is diminished in autistic persons, but the inability to grasp a coherent whole can be seen as an advanced capability to manage local information. And then the weak central coherence is seen as a cognitive style, not as an impairment. So from cases like this, the example on immobility or diverse mobility, and the example of autism that I'm adding, Gleiking concludes that the determination of illness cannot depend only on the assessment of the characteristics of a person, or to go back to my initial terminology, cannot be based only on the impairments of the person. So it is required a complex evaluation that takes in consideration the characteristics of the person, even the impairments of the person. But it is also important to evaluate, assess the environment where the person lives, and it is important to hear all perspectives, the perspectives of all people involved. And Gleiking criticizes very much also the kind of theories that identify what is valuable in human life with an adaptive function in the past, but also the advantages that a condition can have in the present. Nothing of this implies an evaluation of what is good for all humans. And this is, among else, he says, the teaching of the Darwinian theory, because as this theory shows, what is an advantage is a variable question. So evaluations, they could even need to be individualized, because we must recognize to a person the entitlement to decide whether she is an atypical and not a disabled member of his or her group. So think about the deaf persons I mentioned above, and they could say, and some of them actually say, that they are nothing different from a linguistic minority. And this is represented very well. This idea of Jessica Began is represented very well in a same film, Drive My Car, where part of the plot includes a Japanese theater, where the director wants to put on scene the Chekhov's Uncle Vanya. And the specificity is that every actor and every actress is from a different state and speaks a different language. So everybody, in order to be understood, needs a translator, and everybody, in order to understand others, needs a translator. And one of the actresses is a deaf person. She communicates through the language of signs, but she is exactly in the identical position as everybody else in this context. So an example that very much speaks in favor of Jessica Began's theory. Or other cases are those of autistic persons who declare themselves as merely neurodiverse. And Gleiking challenges through such theses, examples, arguments, the more radical Aristotelian expressions, but also the more liberal, like that of Martha Nussbaum, that nevertheless starts from an idea of human dignity that is common to all people, which Gleiking says is sufficiently disrespectful of the diversity among people. So the evaluative standpoint of humanity is what's wrong, because it's a kind of imposition of a common standard that is not justified for all people, because people can legitimately disagree with this common standard. By this, Gleichen does not want to say that it is good to have some impairments, or even that, unfortunately, rather easily, these impairments can be transformed or interpreted as disabilities. He only says that we cannot establish this a priori, that we cannot start from a theoretical construction of human nature, of human dignity, and then derive theoretical consequences for this. We must take very seriously in consideration that there are diverse scales of evaluation of different persons and of different way of being or doing. And we must respect very much the attitude of those people who identify themselves with their condition and require not to be considered as deficient members of a wider group, like, for example, humanity in general. And now is the question of what is the proper response in a democratic liberal society toward cases like this. And now I read a quote by Shane Gleichen. If we are to avoid offending and stigmatizing the disabled community, we need an alternative to evaluation by the species norm. The appropriate alternative in a liberal democracy is to make the appropriate standards of evaluation a matter of open-ended negotiation between medical professionals, society in general, and individuals themselves. There is not just one type of person, nor just two. So evaluations have to be made in a fine-grained discursive basis. So clearly a view opposed to the Aristotelian one, where we start from a common idea of humanity, of human flourishing, of human dignity. And typically, says Gleichen, the best approach is to attribute authority to the choice of a person. And this view has several analogies to Jessica Begin's view. Now, I'm not going to describe in more details. I'll take just the two views together because there's strong similarities. So, at this point, the common teaching of or claim of Begin and Gleichen is that the important point for the present discussion is that disability is constituted by an interaction of an impairment and external circumstances. And if we take seriously in consideration the perspective of a person, we can recognize that she does not care, and she can legitimately not care about the absence of a capability. And in this sense, there is at least a serious problem to impose the qualification of disability to the condition of that person. So we must really very seriously take in consideration what the person thinks. So this is the position of Shane Gleichen and Jessica Begin. In my view, their proposal is very important because it is very important to consider the personal perspective as important. And it is important, for example, and primarily as a safeguard against discrimination and repression, denounced, for example, by Thomas Szasz in psychiatry and denounced in more recent times by the neurodiversity movement, not only more recent, but really in actual times. But although these recommendations are very important, and because taking in consideration seriously and strongly the personal perspectives is very important, this must be done carefully in order to avoid other possible problems like denying the status of disability when it is justified. And this is one of the reasons because some strong disputes are not only between people with some impairments and other people, but between people with impairments themselves. And we must be careful among us, also because the personal perspective can be problematic for various reasons. For example, epistemic flaws. People can be unable to assess their condition, for example, because of adaptive preferences. So some people can say, I don't care about this impairment, I don't consider myself disabled, but just because of adaptive preferences, just because she has been convinced by the social atmosphere that her condition is unchangeable. All other problems are kind of immorality, expression of immorality, because some people can have interests in being recognized as disabled in order to receive social support instead of other kinds of reaction. One possible solution is that of relativizing the attribution of disability. According to this strategy, we could say that A is disabled, while A is in a similar or identical or analogous condition like B, who is not disabled, and what makes the difference is the assessment of A and B. So A is disabled because A is impaired, in this way deprived of something A is very much interested in. Well, this is not the case of B, and this is one of them is disabled and the other is not. But and at the end, this relativization is something that both Glekin and Begon are ready to accept. So at the end, although we must make some verifications to realize what is really what a person thinks, after have done this, we must recognize the voice of the person as the final authority. But I think that relativization is not a completely satisfactory answer. Why? Because sometimes there are clear conflicts that depend on evaluations and that must be publicly resolved. We cannot simply be satisfied by the relativization and accept that a condition can be, the same condition can be a disability or not a disability, independent of the evaluation of persons. Sometimes we really must have a public attitude about this, about then the duties that we have toward these conditions. For example, from the standpoint of social inclusion, do we have to modify our environment in order to make it more hospitable toward the condition? Or we are justified in not modifying some aspects of our environment and simply say that the person has a form of disability. Again, I rely on an example of a film to show a situation where it could be justified to say that the disability is present, and even if we arrive at the limits of our possibility to make a hospitable condition, we cannot be fully socially inclusive for these persons. So again, the example is from a film, another film, The Square. And the situation described in this scene is a press conference where an art critic and present an exhibition, and there is a person shouting with very bad insults all the time from the audience. At some point, the art critic tells the audience, please don't blame the person, he is my husband and he has the Tourette syndrome. So I'm personally don't know what Tourette syndromes look like, so my present comment relies on how it is represented in the film. but if in at least some manifestation it is like it is in the film, then I think we need to speak about the disability, because we simply can't make sufficiently hospitable the environment to these people with their characteristics. So making, as the film Square shows, making the environment hospitable to a person in such a form of Tourette syndrome simply disintegrates some practices. So a press conference is not possible in these conditions. And then we must say, if we want to have the practice of press conferences, unfortunately, we must exclude people who can't control themselves, shouting and insulting all the time. Unfortunately, we have a disability of social participation. Then another reason that, in my view, indicates that we cannot be satisfied with relativization is the question of children. This is visible in front of the dilemma whether to treat a child or not. And for example, there are requirements of some deaf people who want their deaf children not to be treated, because they say it's not a disability. And how can we react in such cases? One possibility, very much coherent with the strategy of relativization, is to leave the choice to parents. So the same as we leave to parents to decide whether their children will learn to play a piano or a violin or not, we must leave to parents the authority to decide whether their children will be treated from deafness or not, or also some mental conditions. But I think that this solution is very problematic, and I think this exactly for the arguments that Mill and Brian Barry offer against challenges of multiculturalism, where some communities require the right to exclude their children from the education provided to children in society. Or there are some multicultural requirements to permit practices like clitoridectomy or infibulation. So if we don't establish that some form of deprivations are disabilities, how can we criticize such practices? For example, if we don't establish that a condition that does not permit to regularly, in a satisfactory way, to enjoy sex, how can we say that clitoridectomy is a wrong practice? So in my view, it is a wrong practice. And this is because what happens with clitoridectomy is the cause of a disability in a person, which then is the basis for saying that such or similar situation of impossibility to enjoy sexual pleasure is a disability as well. And the same for the capacity to hear and other capacities. So what is the solution? The solution is a proper epistemology and a proper model of public justification. Am I right that we started in 2015 and that I have 45 minutes to speak, or am I out of time?
I think you have 15 more minutes or so. That would be.
Okay, thank you very much.
Is that?
I hope it will be less than 15. Okay, thank you. So the epistemology that I propose is a weak externalist epistemology, and the model of public justification is a convergence model of public justification. And now I explain these concepts. We verify whether an evaluative standard is publicly justified in two steps. First, we verify whether an evaluative standard is justified for a person. An evaluative standard, for example, is an evaluative standard that says that it is a valuable component of a life, of a human life, the possibility, the capacity of sociability or affiliation, empathy, enjoying other people's company. So first, we verify whether these standards are justified for each person. We verify whether it is justified for person A, the person B, the person C. And what does it mean that an evaluative standard is justified for a person? This means that there is a sound deliberative route, proper reasoning, a valid inference from the system of reasons of a person to this evaluative standard. And this is why we speak of weak externalist epistemology. It is only a weak externalist epistemology because we start from the reasons that matter for the person. There are no reasons externally imposed. But it is not needed that the person herself is capable of realizing what follows from the reasons that matter for the person. And what is the system of reasons? Well, the set of deeply rooted reasons that are of greatest importance for a person, like her beliefs, her preferences, her value commitments, and so on and so forth. So first is the step of seeing whether a standard is justified for each single person from the standpoint of what matters to that person. And then we arrive to the step of public justification when we realize what is justified to all persons, which are the standards that are justified for all of them. And we can say the standards are publicly justified only when there is a convergence of what is justified to every single person. And I suppose that we immediately see that this convergence model of public justification is protective of the personal perspectives of people, of their diversity, and saves from repression and discrimination, because an evaluative standard is not publicly justified if it is not acceptable under due consideration by all persons. So homosexuality, for example, could not be publicly justified because its indication as an illness is not publicly justified, is not weakly externalistically justified for all people. So it saves diversity and protection from impositions and oppression and repression. But it has also the epistemological merit of saving from personal flaws, because it is weakly externalist. And in this sense, there is not a total authority to what people say, but the authority of people is represented by their entitlement to establish what matters to them. But we are aware that they can make mistakes in assessing what follows from what matters to them. And then this assessment can be external. And this is what is protective of epistemic flaws. And at this point, again, I am in agreement with Jessica Begon, who says that rather than focusing on whether an individual explicitly considers themselves disadvantaged by some condition, we focus on whether this is entailed by their conception of the good. Thus, an individual in an abusive relationship, for example, may not recognize the relationship as bad for them. But if they value bodily autonomy and freedom from emotional abuse, it would still be disadvantaged by their own lives. So we can say the same for some impairments. In this way, some candidates for evaluative standards could be confirmed, but others could be eliminated. So, as we see, the similarities with Begon are strong. The differences, however, appear in the sense that at the end, Begon attributes the final authority to the personal perspective, while I think that at least in the field of psychiatry, we must leave also very open the door to external evaluation. Why specific in psychiatry? But I think also in other fields, but specifically in psychiatry, because the problem, typical problem with psychiatric conditions, like indicated by George Graham, is exactly non-responsiveness to reasons. And yes, this is the point of divergence with Begon, who does not embrace the externalist epistemology that I think it is proper in the present discussion. However, I accept the idea that we must be very, very, very careful when we apply the externalist part of the epistemology that I proposed. And it must be applied only when there is really clear evidence that the person makes mistakes in her own inferences. Okay, so where have I arrived with the present discussion? I come to the conclusion. The view that I offer, in my view, represents a reasonable balance between respecting the systems of reasons of a person and a reasonableness in public evaluation. And in fact, I think that it is the best way to respect the reasonableness of a person when present, or her individuality in general. In conclusion, I think that the convergence public justification model with a weak externalist epistemology represents the most promising answer to the anti-psychiatry and the neurodiversity challenges so far. The justificatory model protects diversity and safeguards against epistemic and other flaws. In this way, it stems both unfair attribution of disability as well as unfair denial of disability. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Elvio, for this great presentation. Yeah, questions? Nicola first, Valeria second. Oh, you can't hear me? So then
I can hear you fine, Miklos. It's just that I think we were clapping. I think we might both have some feedback as well.
Okay, so Nicola, you have a question, right?
That was not. Sorry, I agree with Valeria. There was you were.
Okay, I'm sorry. What about you, Valeria?
I do, but that was also clapping. Thank you, Elvio. That was the first message of my use of emoticons. No, I have a few. I wonder whether maybe Miklos, you wanna.
Yes. So whatever works. I also have some questions to Elvio.
So why don't you start and I'll collect my thoughts just for a second.
Okay, let's do that.
Yeah,
so Elvio, thank you very much. So I just start with two quick points. One is that maybe in the context of your paper, maybe perhaps it would make sense to differentiate between mental impairments and mental illnesses. Because imagine that you have some strong form of mental impairment that you are not really responsive to most reasons, but it seems that there I think in general this is not an illness. This is just basically a condition. But there are cases where you, as that you use, like cases of depression, when there is some let's call it some bad way to respond to certain reasons. And it seems that there is a meaningful difference, or an important difference between these cases. And the second question is that I would perhaps a little bit disagree with your clitoridectomy. Okay, I will not be able to pronounce this. Clitoridectomy case, yes, that's the. You have that analogy there, but I think it's a little bit, deafness is a little bit different, because in case of a clitoridectomy, you force a woman to lose a very important sexual function, whereas in the case of deafness, those parents who don't want to have cochlear implants for their kids, they don't want to basically deny them the function of communication. They only perhaps closing them one way of communicating rather than another way of communicating. So I think that's an important difference.
Yeah, so thank you very much for both questions. Related to the first, I agree that there is a difference between impairment and illness, and impairment does not necessarily transform in illness. It depends on several things. One of them is also environment, for example. So I will tell a personal anecdote of a conversation I had with my colleague and friend, and she's a psychologist, and I asked her whether she can counsel me a treatment for my phobia for snakes. And then her question was whether I frequently encounter snakes. And I said, no, I never encounter snakes. So then she asked me, so why you want to treat that phobia? It's totally not harmful to you. And in some sense, it is an impairment. So, for example, for me, I'm very much inhibited, and it's almost impossible to enter by myself in a wood. If I'm in company, then I feel more comfortable. But in fact, I never have the necessity to go by myself in a wood. And in this sense, why to consider this impairment as a disability or an illness? And in things like this, yes, I agree. There must be some harm, and there must be also some harm from my point of view. If I'm totally not interested in something, and with reason, not because of adaptive preferences, then why consider this as a disability or illness?
Yeah. Tone deafness could be an example too.
Sorry?
Tone deafness could be an example too. If you are not interested in music, then...
Yes, so this is more complicated, deafness. And I had long discussions with Jessica Begon on this, because Jessica Begon is has exactly your strategy. So she says that what matters is not the possibility to hearing or speaking through voice, is the possibility to communicate. So if we organize the society in a different way, so that we can ensure people the possibility to communicate without speaking or hearing, then everything that we need to ensure, everything the person is entitled to, is realized. And here I mentioned the example of the film Drive My Car that represents exactly this. However, I think that the possibility of hearing is very much inclusive, is very much present, is very much extended in our life. and that yes, some people could be not interested in music. Like there are some people that could be not interested in everything. There are some people that are not interested in living, for example. But nonetheless, if we look from the general perspective of all the capacities, all the possibilities to enjoy, all the possibilities of emotional relations that the person can have, I think it could be more difficult to say that the person is really disinterested in everything this. So think about music. For some of them, for some of us, it's an artistic enjoyment, listening Bach or Miles Davis or Bruce Springsteen. Then there is the emotional element. So I suppose that at least some, but I suspect most of us, remember the song that was playing while we were for the first time kissing the person of our first love. So it has a deep emotional impact. It has a big social impact. So partying, clubbing. Think about the song Save the Last Dancer for me. Is the song of a person who has not the possibility to walk and dance. And the message is, he says to his wife, you can dance with whoever you want the whole evening, but please save the last dance for me, at least the last song, stay with me. And obviously it is a life of a person who accepted his condition, but nonetheless, I think we all have a sense of sadness in thinking about this. So for those of us who love football or other sports, the pleasure of singing with other football fans. Okay, for each single example, Jessica told me, yeah, but what if one does not care? What if one does not care? Okay, I don't know what to say about a person who doesn't care about anything of what I have mentioned. Or the voice of our child, the first time I heard our child crying, for example. I mean, are all things of very deep impact. And this is one line of the argument, that it's really very difficult to imagine a human life that is completely disinterested on all this. In any case, the question is whether anyone else has the right to decide instead of other people, whether this is meaningful or not. And here I arrive with the analogy with clitoridectomy. So there are also people disinterested in sex and enjoying sex. And this is the example of another example of Jessica Begon, asexual persons. Leave them like they are, it's not a disability. But then my argument comes, and it's very direct, so it's not analogy with deafness, because here my argument comes, but if asexuality is not a disability, if the choice of parents is like the choice whether the child will go to play tennis or will go to learn dancing, then what's so wrong in clitoridectomy? Yeah, okay. Typically, they do not use anesthesia, there are no hygienic conditions and so on. But imagine that there are safe chirurgical surgery conditions. So what would be wrong with clitoridectomy? Nonetheless, we think it's horrible. And by the same way, I think it's horrible because we think that what this practice deprives a person is really losing something important. If we then, I make here the analogies, we really think of asexuality as possibly not a disability, which ground we have to condemn clitoridectomy. Or think about parents excluding their child from some parts of the school curriculum for religious reasons. So as Brian Berry enumerates some of these cases, not reading parts of literature. And imagine that some parents decide that their children will not listen music classes because music is not permitted by their religion. well, we will feel that there is some injustice here, I suppose, because the parents decide to shape the life of their children in a way that we think is not legitimate, but we think because they are making a decision instead of their child and depriving of something that is potentially important for the child. The basic of my argument is the capacity to make choices, which, however, is not the capacity to make choices of the parents, but capacity to make choices of the future child, of the actual child, the future adult person.
So, Elvio, thanks. Here are some complications for the second answer. So actually, I had this debate with, you might remember, because it was one of the summer universities you organized when Julian Savulescu was a guest. So I had the same debate with Savulescu, and he also told me that, look, blind people are unable to enjoy the Mona Lisa and other really, really important artworks. And my answer was that, okay, but it's not, I would go further than Bigan, saying that it's not just the individual, but actually the disability social movement has never such things on their radar. They didn't ask for, well, we should be able to enjoy the Mona Lisa, but they asked for accommodations that basically make them functionally, make them better functioning people in a certain environment. And here is where, for example, Bigan's theory has a real contribution, I think, to the whole literature, when she's saying there are some capabilities or functionings which are basically justified by justice. So this is what we as a community are required to provide to people to function as equals in a society. That's one thing. Another thing is that that Elizabeth Barnes has this view that once you believe that disability is just a mere difference and not a bad difference, so it's neutral, then it doesn't follow that you should be able to cause bodily harm to anyone or cause a disability. So that would be probably is that once that you believe that asexuality is fine, it doesn't follow that you could just cause a bodily harm to anyone based on that judgment. And regarding there is a complex maybe a complexity or a complication regarding the child's rights to an open future is that cochlear implants, so sometimes you have to choose either one way or another, but you cannot maintain a set of options. And that might be a problem, is that in case of a cochlear implant, you either the child remains in the community, in the functional community of the parent, staying as a hearing impaired person, or the child will have hearing and be member of another community, but not their parents. So it's just, I think it's just it's important to keep that in mind, that sometimes choosing one way closes another, and this idea of an open future is just simply not possible. You have to choose between what direction do you go. Thank you.
So thank you. So there are various points I will focus on, which seems to me the most central, which are the first and the last. But if you want, we can focus also on the other. But related to your first question, yeah, that's interesting. So usually these movements are not struggling for the possibility to see the Mona Lisa, but they are struggling for more social inclusion and so on. But this is because of the social exclusion that they are suffering now, that other questions arrive in a second step. But it's a normal, how to say, path of all disadvantaged groups to start from what's more urgent. So If you don't permit me to enter in a house, the first thing that I ask is to be permitted to enter in the house. And then the right to sit is the second thing that I will ask after I will enter in the house. So after some forms of social inclusion will be realized, then obviously or not obviously, but what seems to me the natural path is that then we will focus on other things that we nonetheless see as very important to us. And it's not only seeing the Mona Lisa again, I would say, but there are so many things that have such strong impact in our life, and that we think would be a loss not to having them. Okay, then you can say there are some people who don't enjoy these things and don't feel that they are deprived of something. And the question that appears now, that I also put to Jessica Began, is let's try to see what's the methodology of verifying whether something could be. Let's remember, for her again, it's a kind of not depending on the answer of the person, but depending of what follows from what matters. The difference between her and me is what could matter for a person in a more open way to understanding what's open to the person. And I think that a possible methodology that is also an answer to your final point is to verify not primarily also, but not primarily or not only by relying on what say people who are deprived of something, asking them whether they think they are deprived, but asking people who have something whether they would accept to be deprived of this, because they can compare the two situations. And by this, I arrived to the answer to your last point, when you said, okay, it's not a choice between this or that, but if they hear they are not anymore members of the society. Well, this is not totally exact. I mean, it's not exact, because they have the capability to hear, and at some point it's their decision whether they think, okay, but this is not so important to me. It's more important my link with my community. And then I simply deprive myself of the capability to hear, something each of us can realize with more or less difficulties, or the capability to see. And then the answer that happens in the multicultural field, where the analogous is difficult, where the analogy is present, is yes, but they will not choose to their original community. They will enjoy what they have, and this will create problems for the survival of our community. So, for example, those communities who say we don't want our children to learn also the majority language, or we don't want our children to have education so that they can have jobs also different from the traditional jobs of our community, which is a requirement of the travelers, for example, I think exactly in England. But then there is Brian Barry's argument, let's leave the choice. If a community, a way of living is massively not chosen by those that can choose, then the conclusion natural is that there is a problem with this. So if a person who can see says, yeah, I will have the contact with the blind community as much as I can have, but I don't want to renounce to this capacity, this is an indication that it is a valuable and important capacity.
Okay, thank you, Elvio. Valeria.
Yes, hi. Sorry, let me just, lower my hand. So thank you, Elvio. This is a really articulate take on all the components and major, I think, objections that can be launched against kind of recentering the subject, but in a way that doesn't conceive, I think, the subject as an isolated individual, but we're all subjects in collectivities and communities. And so I really enjoyed in your presentation so far, not coming from a specialist background that we share as like an insistence on finding negotiating grounds, at least in between public positions and justifications and an idea of self-determination. I have, as a non-specialist, two questions that I hope you can translate in your own maybe vocabulary, but that I feel perhaps you touched upon, and they were, and I would really love to hear a little bit more about. So my first question has to do a little bit going back to the question of psychiatry and antipsychiatry. So I will leave disabilities maybe on just on the side for a second, because one of the interesting pivots, I think, of what you propose is this idea of reasonableness and this capacity of making reasonable choices or being able to express preferences and affording them. It's very much at the center of the contestations to psychiatry at the level of diagnosis. So this is the first level. However, what I would like to hear more is that most political struggles around psychiatry are not, I would say, separating the problem of diagnosis from that of therapeutic choices. So in other words, it seems to me that a lot that has to do with the self-determination and centering the subject is not so much happening at the stage of accepting or not a diagnosis, but is about what then it's supposed to happen in a therapeutic context. Now, so a little bit what you were maybe touching upon with the phobia scenario, like whether it's about pharmaceutical interventions or institutionalization interventions, or a number of other questions around that. So I would like to hear more about what's how is this idea of reasonableness playing not so much in the diagnosis phase, but in what follows an identification moment. I wonder whether maybe this is a question that could make sense to speak about disabilities in this broader sense, but I will stick to what I know a little bit more about, which is antipsychiatry. The second point, and then I'll stop. I would like to problematize this idea of identifying or not identifying oneself as disabled or impaired, also in a matter, in a way that disrupts our idea of normality. I would like to hear a bit more about that. Like, what would be different implications of what you propose for defining and redefining them, like normals of like, because again, my research has been more on the looking at some of these questions from a perspective of bottom-up struggles around healthcare, and the majority of movements are very much focused on disrupting this idea that normality is about a body that is productive in a capitalist sense. So you need to be able to work, and this is very far away from enjoying the Mona Lisa. So the opportunity to self-define or not self-define as a disabled person pretty much intercepts with a lot of questions around not so much what matters for the full enjoyment of life, but being put to work in specific ways, or becoming a body from which value is extracted by being subjected to treatments or all kinds of kind of institutional procedures that then prevent accessing work. So I wonder whether any of these resonates, or so maybe a bit more of implications of what you're saying for this idea of normality, and on the one hand, yeah, and my previous question around what happens after a diagnosis in all of these cases. Thank you. I hope it makes some sense. I'm not sure from your extraction, but if not, I'm happy to clarify as much as I can.
Thank you very much, Valeria. That's really interesting. So related to the concept of normality, I try to realize the project without making any use of the concept of normality. So mainly for this criticism of Aristotelianism, I think we can get anything good from the normative point of view of starting from a conception of normality. Because we must recognize also, I mean, first, because it's difficult to establish what's normal, and it's simply contingent, result of contingent mutations of environment and reaction to this. But second, also because of the duty to recognize the right to diversity. So if one does not want to conform to normality, then we must recognize this entitlement. And the central role that is played by normality for many authors, in my view, must be played by the concept of public justification. So the question is not what is normal, because speaking frankly, there are different ways to establish.
I absolutely agree. I don't use it, and I really appreciate that you never mention normality. What I was suggesting is that there is a in lieu of normality, health struggles identify productivity. So the idea that the body must be able to perform work that is monetizable is like the baseline against which a lot of disability justice movements have been very vocal around. No? That, so I was wondering if that resonates at all.
Yeah, okay. But I think that what you are saying only confirms what I say, that we do not get a lot from the conception of normality, because dependently of the worldview, normality could also be defined in different ways. So imagine an aristocratic sub-society like the one that we can see in the TV series The Crown. There, the capacity to work, I think, is not so much rewarded. There are other things that are much more rewarded. And so it's also varies. Either we define normality as statistical frequency, we do not have normatively a lot from this, or normality as an adaptation to a situation, but there can be different adaptations and the situations can change, or normality as you are doing from what is, how to say, highly appreciated inside of a worldview, but then what justifies the worldview. So, yeah, I don't know whether normality in the actual word is capacity to work. It includes capacity to work, but in my view, it doesn't include only this. So to reduce the conception of normality, even in a capitalist society, I think is really not considering also the complexities of these societies. So, yeah. But I mean, I'm not able to go too much further on the discussion of what could be normality, because I'm trying to do all my job without any appeal to the concept of normality. And related to your first question, yes, certainly there is a difference between defining a condition as disability and treating that condition. And in my view, there is more space for individual choices when we speak about treatment. So a person must have the right of declaring her condition as satisfactory for her and that she doesn't want to be treated. But I think that disability is important as well, independently of treatment, because treatment is only one of the possible consequences of disability. So in some cases, disability implies treatment when we think that the person is not capable of making reasonable choices for herself. Person in a condition of very radical forms of delusion, for example. could be such a case, but I mean, it's just an attempt of hypothesis. In other cases, the person has the legitimacy to decide for herself. But in some cases, however, independently of the treatment, so there could be, how to say, stimulus to think why we speak about definition of disability. The important thing is speaking about treatment. But the reactions to disability are not exhausted only by treatments. So it's the shaping on an environment. As I was saying with the case of the Tourette syndrome, it is not only a question that the person can say, I'm happy with my condition, I don't want to be treated. Because there are other situations where we must see what are the implications of this. An implication could be, yeah, the person is happy. In fact, we don't have any reason to think there is anything wrong in this condition, and we must radically modify our social practices to make them hospitable to the person. Well, then if Tourette syndrome is like in the film The Square, then obviously this does not only imply changing some of our practices, but potentially disintegrating some of our practices. So permitting a person the right to render impossible this communication that we are having today, or policy toward children. Then if we declare that something is not a disability, then parents have the right to decide not only that they themselves will not be treated, but that also their children will not be treated, which I think is more problematic. So defining disability has wider implications than what happens to the person herself. This is why it's important to define disability.
So Valeria, do you have a rejoinder too?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, thanks. I think it's it will need to be for another day, maybe, because we are already a bit over. And no, I just wanted to close by saying that I regret bringing normality into the picture, because I absolutely agree that we can happily leave that terminology
without normality.
yes, let's please. And also this idea of what follows a diagnosis, that it doesn't need to be treatment as in a personal treatment, but we should, in the spirit of Basaglia, change society more than to accommodate all kinds of desires and capabilities and affordances, for sure. I think it was, yeah, somehow an attempt at like teasing out this question of reason that seemed to me central to the theory of also this interface between the person.
Yeah, so I'm very much in, how to say, in sympathy with approaches like Basaglia or even the antipsychiatry, because I see as a possible, I mean, recently in Pavia, where I gave this same talk, I got objection from the different point of view. The objection was that with the convergence model, very few conditions will be justified as conditions of disability. And I said, I don't see this as a bad consequence. So I think that we really must be open to differences. What, however, I think is that we must establish a point that nonetheless permits the functioning of some social practices in a way that we think is justified. So again, the Tourette syndrome, but other cases as well. And also decisions about third parts, where I think decisions about children are important. So that we must identify some capabilities as important and their as absence as disability in order to be protective of third part. Because as we know also from the discussions on multiculturalism, our sympathies frequently changes on dependence on where is our focus to see who are the weak part. And the sympathy will go for the weak. So if we look of the general society and we think about the cultural minority in the society, we will think about the cultural minority as the weak, and we will require protection for them, and then multiculturalism. And then it appeared an article, is multiculturalism bad for women? And then if we think about the women inside of these communities, then our sympathy is for the women, because then they are the weak. And we think, okay, no, there is a point where we must interfere. I mean, some of us think there is a point where we must interfere inside the communities. So also when we think about disabled people or people with disabilities, our sympathy or my sympathies are totally with them. So make them, how to say, organize the society to be maximally supportive and open and hospitable to them, and permit them the rights to make choices about themselves. But then again, if you think about other people inside their communities, then I become more protective about these people. So my idea is, how can one decide to deprive his or her child of the possibility of hearing, seeing, with all the social and emotional consequences, or even professional perspectives that this can have? And how can one make decisions instead of other people? Yeah. Okay.
I think, Valeria, am I right that our time is over, unfortunately? So this was a very, very interesting presentation, Elvio. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you for all of the participants for joining us today. And now after this, I think it's time to say goodbye to each other. And I'm sure we will find ways to continue this conversation.
Yes, thank you very much for the attention, and very much for your comments that, are very helpful for me at this stage on the work on this paper, that I see it's divisive, or like all the disputes, because dependence on the audience, there appears objections from different sides. And I think that's the fate of us Rawlsians, that we try always to be somewhere in between, and then there are always criticisms from the two sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elvio. Thank you, Miklos. And thanks all the participants. And I formally close the session on behalf of CAS, but we shall be in touch with Professor Baccarini in Rijeka for sure, away from computer, away from keyboard, hopefully.
Okay.
Soon, for those of us who are here. And so see you all next week, or I think one of the last sessions before the break.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.